There is a fear so quiet, so deeply buried, that most people never speak its name out loud. It does not announce itself the way anger does. It does not arrive with the shaking hands of panic or the hollow ache of grief. It moves more carefully than that. It hides beneath the surface of ordinary days. Inside the pause before you speak in a room full of people. Inside the way you check your phone after sending a message, waiting to see how it lands. Inside the sleepless moment at midnight when something someone said replays itself. Not once, not twice, but over and over and over. Each repetition slightly sharper than the last. It lives in the space between who you are and who you need other people to believe you are. And for most human beings, without ever admitting it, without ever quite naming it, this fear quietly governs enormous portions of their life. Not the dramatic, visible kind of fear. Not the fear you can point to and say, "There it is. That is what I am afraid of." But the slow, patient, relentless fear of the image others hold of you, and the silent terror that one day, without warning, that image might crack. Sit with that for a moment. Notice if it touches something in you. There was a scholar who lived during the time the Buddha walked the dusty roads of northern India. His name is not remembered by history. He is known only through a single brief account, preserved in the oldest layers of Buddhist literature, mentioned almost as a footnote. He was a man of considerable learning. He had studied under multiple teachers. He had memorized vast stretches of sacred text. When he spoke in the assembly of scholars and monks, people listened. People nodded. He was known. He was regarded. And then one day, a younger monk asked him a question he could not answer. The room was silent. Not a dramatic silence, just a moment, a few seconds perhaps, in which the scholar's mouth opened and no answer came. He answered, eventually. He deflected. He changed the subject with the ease of a man practiced at navigating conversations. And outwardly, nothing changed. The gathering continued. People dispersed. Life went on. But something happened inside that scholar, in that brief silence that would quietly torment him for months. He began to rehearse. In his private moments, he began to rehearse better answers to the question he had failed to answer. He began to over-prepare for every gathering, reading texts he had already read, rehearsing responses to questions that had not been asked. He began to watch the younger monk from a distance, noticing what people said to him, watching whether people seemed to favor his questions over the scholar's answers. He did not tell anyone about this. He did not even fully admit it to himself. He told himself he was simply deepening his practice, sharpening his knowledge, being diligent. He dressed the fear in respectable clothing and called it virtue. This is what the fear of losing respect does to a person. It is one of the most skilled illusionists the mind has ever created. It does not walk in through the front door. It slips in through the back, wearing disguises you designed yourself. It calls itself perfectionism. It calls itself high standards. It calls itself caring deeply about your work. It calls itself responsibility, ambition. And because it wears these disguises so convincingly, most people carry it for an entire lifetime without ever quite recognizing what it actually is. The Buddha did not encounter this scholar and deliver a lecture. What he did, according to that brief account, was far simpler and far more devastating. He asked the scholar a question. not about the philosophy the scholar had failed to answer, about something far closer. He asked, "Who is the one who is afraid?" The scholar began to answer with doctrine. The Buddha stopped him gently. Not doctrine, not teaching, not words from a text. I am asking you, who, right now inside you, is afraid? The scholar fell silent. A different kind of silence this time. The question had reached past all the armor. Most people, when they encounter Buddhist teachings about the self, hear something like this. The self is an illusion. The ego does not exist. You are not who you think you are. And almost everyone who hears this responds the same way. They nod. They say yes. Yes, the ego is the problem. And then they carry their ego home with them and spend the next several years trying to defeat it, suppress it, rise above it, or feel guilty every time they notice it has returned. This is the misunderstanding. The Buddha was not saying the ego is the enemy. He was not saying the self is something to be destroyed or condemned. He was pointing at something far more subtle and far more interesting than that. He was saying the self is a process, not a thing. There is a difference between those two words that most people walk past without pausing. A thing is solid. A thing can be owned, defended, lost. A thing has a boundary, a definition, a fixed identity. When you believe yourself is a thing, you spend your life protecting it, because things can be threatened, damaged, stolen, diminished. But a process is different. A process is movement. A river is a process. You cannot take a river home and own it. You cannot defend a river from change. The river is change. The river is nothing but change. And yet, the river is real. Undeniably, powerfully, beautifully real. Yourself is a river. It is a process of constant arising and dissolving. Thoughts, feelings, perceptions, memories, habits, stories, all moving through awareness the way water moves through a landscape. Never the same twice, never fixed, never quite what you remember it being the last time you looked. The fear of losing respect is the suffering that happens when you forget this, when you mistake the river for a statue. When you begin to believe that this image, this collection of other people's perceptions of you, is a solid thing that can be permanently secured, permanently maintained, and so you spend enormous energy not on living, but on management, on the careful, exhausting management of how you appear, on monitoring, adjusting, correcting, performing, all in service of keeping the statue intact. The insight the Buddha offered was not destroy your ego. It was something far quieter. He was saying, look more carefully. Look at what you are actually afraid of losing. And when you look carefully enough, you will discover that what you are trying to protect was never as solid as you believed. This is not meant to be frightening. When the scholar finally sat with the Buddha's question, when he finally allowed himself to look directly at the fear, he did not find a solid thing there either. He found movement. He found thoughts about how others saw him. He found memories of past moments of recognition and the hunger for more of them. He found a story, endlessly revised, about who he needed to be in order to deserve his place in the world. He found a river, not a statue, and for the first time in months, he breathed. That breathing That moment of recognizing the constructed nature of what had felt so absolutely solid and real is what the Buddha was pointing at. Not the absence of self, the understanding of it. Walk into any city in the modern world. Look at the faces of the people around you, not the surface expressions, the managed ones, the ones people have practiced for public spaces. Look at the eyes. Look at what lives beneath the practiced expression. You will see it everywhere once you know how to recognize it. The professional who has spent 15 years building a reputation in their field, who wakes up each morning and checks their email before they check on their own breathing, not because they love their work more than themselves, but because somewhere in the architecture of their psychology, their work and their worth have become the same thing. Their career is not what they do. It is who they are. And every review, every evaluation, every comment from a colleague carries the weight of a verdict on their fundamental value as a human being. The parent who cannot let their child fail at anything, not because they are protecting the child, but because the child's success has become tangled up with their own respectability. Other parents will judge. The neighborhood will notice. Something about their adequacy as a mother, as a father, as a person has been quietly transferred onto this small human who never asked to carry that weight. The young person who has grown up inside the architecture of social media, who has learned through thousands of hours of conditioning that their value can be quantified in numbers, followers, likes, views, comments. Who wakes up and reaches for their phone the way a previous generation reached for a cigarette, not for pleasure, but for relief from the anxiety of not knowing, for a few hours, how they are being perceived. The quiet middle-aged person sitting alone at a dinner party, saying all the right things, laughing at all the right moments, internally miles away, running a constant background calculation of whether the people in the room still think well of them, whether something they said last week may have shifted things, whether the person across the table is smiling at them with genuine warmth or polite tolerance. None of these people are weak. None of them are broken. None of them are doing something that other humans do not do. What they are doing is suffering from one of the most ancient and most invisible forms of human pain, the pain of having outsourced their sense of worth to the perceptions of other people. And this outsourcing carries a particular kind of exhaustion, not the clean, satisfying exhaustion of hard physical work or genuine creative effort, but the exhaustion of surveillance. The exhaustion of always watching yourself through imagined eyes. The exhaustion of living your life as if it were a performance, being assessed by an audience you cannot quite see. The Buddha called this kind of suffering particularly stubborn, not because it is the deepest suffering, but because it is so thoroughly disguised as something else. It disguises itself as success. It disguises itself as social grace. It disguises itself as being a good professional, a respectable parent, a person who cares what others think, which sounds from the outside like a reasonable and admirable quality. But there is a difference, a profound and consequential difference between caring about how your actions affect others and organizing your entire inner life around the management of their perception. One is love. The other is a trap. You are sitting in a meeting, someone else speaks, and the room responds warmly. There is laughter, there is nodding, and something inside you, something you did not invite, something you would not choose, shifts It is not quite jealousy, not quite resentment. It is something subtler and more confusing than either of those. It is a kind of quiet contraction, a tightening. The room has redistributed some invisible currency that you were not aware you needed so badly until just this moment, when you watched it flow towards someone else. You say nothing. You smile. You nod at what they said, because what they said was genuinely good, and you are not the kind of person who fails to acknowledge good work. But underneath the smile, there is a small private war happening that no one in the room can see. A voice is asking, is that how they see me? Less sharp, less interesting, less valuable. Is that the recalibration that just happened, quietly, beneath the surface of this meeting? And then, almost immediately, a second voice rises to shame the first. What is wrong with you? Why does it matter? Why can't you just be happy for them? You are being small. You are being petty. You are not the person you thought you were. And now, there are two sufferings running simultaneously. The original fear of being seen as less, and the secondary suffering of being ashamed of that fear. Layer upon layer, the person trying to maintain dignity from the outside while simultaneously conducting a trial of themselves on the inside. This is the texture of the fear of losing respect when it lives inside a psychologically aware, self-examining person. It does not feel like a simple, straightforward emotion. It feels like a hall of mirrors. Every time you look at the fear, you see yourself looking at it. Every time you judge the fear, you judge yourself for judging it. Every time you try to resolve it, the resolution itself becomes another performance for the internal audience. Then comes the silence. Not rejection, not criticism, just silence. The world receives it and does not visibly respond. And in that silence, something remarkable happens inside you. The work, which felt solid and clear before, begins to look different. You begin to re-examine it. You begin to question whether what felt like clarity was actually self-delusion, whether what felt like courage was actually naivety, whether the silence means indifference or something worse. The work has not changed. Not a single word of it has changed. What has changed is the mirror you are holding it up to. And that mirror belongs not to you, but to the imagined eyes of everyone who has not yet responded. This is the silent suffering the fear of losing respect creates. The way it reaches backward in time and retroactively revises your experience. The way it turns confidence into doubt, clarity into confusion, genuine self-expression into evidence of inadequacy. And the exhausting thing, the truly exhausting thing, is that it never actually protects you. The fear of losing respected does not help you be more respected. It does not make your work better. It does not make you more connected to the people whose regard you are seeking. It simply costs you the present moment, over and over and over again. There is a moment that some people describe reaching not through effort, but through a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of failure, the exhaustion of success, the exhaustion of having done everything the fear asked of them, having maintained the image, managed the perception, received the respect, held the position, and finding that it did not deliver what it promised. The fear of losing respect is powered by a promise. The promise goes something like this: Once enough people see you the right way, once your reputation is secure enough, once your position is stable enough, once the right people know your value, then you will be safe. Then the watching and managing and performing can stop. Then you can rest. But the threshold never arrives. The promise is never kept, because the machinery of reputation management, once set in motion, does not know how to stop. There is always more to protect. There is always someone new whose opinion matters. There is always a higher level of regard to seek, a more complete validation to obtain. The Buddhist psychologist would say, not unkindly, that you are trying to fill a vessel with a hole in it. The vessel is the idea that external regard can provide inner security. The hole is that it cannot. It was never designed to. Not because people are inadequate validators, but because the thing you are trying to address through their validation is not actually located in them. The shift that happens, when it happens, is not dramatic. It rarely arrives with lightning or music. It usually arrives very quietly, often in an ordinary moment. A man is walking alone after another long day of performing the version of himself that his professional world expects. He is tired in that specific way, not physically tired, but tired of the maintenance. And in the quiet of the walk, with no one watching, with no performance required, he notices something he almost always fails to notice. He is still here. He is still himself. Without the audience, without the approval, without the reputation actively being managed, he is still a living, breathing, experiencing human being. The watching and performing were real. But so is this quiet walk, this ordinary evening, this self that exists without anyone confirming it. And the thought that crosses his mind, almost too simple to be significant, is this: I was always here. I did not need to earn this. This is not a philosophical conclusion. It is not a resolved argument. It is something felt rather than thought, a loosening, a small but unmistakable release of something that has been held tightly for a very long time. The Buddha described this kind of moment as a glimpse, not full understanding, not liberation, just a glimpse through the architecture of the fear, a brief sight of what lies behind it. And the remarkable thing about a glimpse is that it cannot be unseen. Once you have seen even briefly that the self you have been protecting with such vigilance is lighter, more fluid, more constructed than it appeared, the fear does not disappear, but it loses a certain density, a certain heaviness. It becomes, very slightly, less convincing. Put the thinking down for a moment. Not the insights, not the understanding, just the thinking. Notice what is here when the thinking quiets. There is awareness. Quiet, steady, unprovoked awareness. Not your awareness of something particular. Not awareness performing a function or solving a problem. Just awareness itself. Present, open, not needing anything from this moment in order to be here. This is the ground, not the thoughts about the ground, not the concept of awareness, the actual living fact of it, the thing that is reading these words right now, the thing that was present before this video began, the thing that will be present after it ends. Fear cannot survive in this space, not because this space is powerful enough to defeat fear, but because fear requires a very specific architecture to sustain itself. It requires a self that can be threatened. It requires a future in which the threat can materialize. It requires a past in which enough evidence has accumulated to make the threat feel probable. And awareness, this simple, quiet background awareness, has none of those things. It is not a self that can be threatened. It is what experiences the threat. It is not located in the future. It is always now. It has no past it is carrying. It is always new. This is why the contemplative traditions across cultures have returned to the same instruction in slightly different words across thousands of years. Be still. Not as a technique, not as a means to an end, but as a recognition of something that is already true. The fear of losing respect requires motion. It requires constant scanning, constant management, constant comparison. The moment genuine stillness enters, not forced stillness, not performed stillness, but the real thing, the machinery of the fear has nowhere to run. Sit with that, not as a practice, not as a method. Just sit with it. Notice the difference between the part of you that is concerned with how you are perceived and the part of you that is simply here, noticing, present, unstained by evaluation. That second part has never needed anyone's respect to exist. It has never sought approval. It has never feared diminishment. It has never been absent from a single moment of your life, including the worst ones, the most humiliating ones, the ones that the fear was most convinced would destroy you. It was there then too, quiet, steady, unharmed. This is what the Buddha called, in language that resists translation but points at something real, the unconditioned. Not the self that was built by experience and maintained by effort, but the awareness in which all experience, including the fear itself, arises and dissolves. You cannot lose the respect of something that has never been conditional on respect. And this quiet, unassuming awareness has never been conditional on anything. The scholar eventually left the gathering of monks, not in disgrace, not dramatically. He simply, one day, stopped attending. He went to live alone for a period, not in protest, not in defeat, but in a kind of tired honesty. He had spent so many years among other people's opinions that he had forgotten what it felt like to exist when no one was watching. He needed to find out whether he still existed then. He did. Of course he did. But more importantly, he discovered something that he had not expected. He discovered that the version of himself that existed in the silence, the one no one was watching, the one that had no reputation to protect, no image to maintain, no position to defend, was not a diminished version. It was not a lesser thing. If anything, it was more present, more alive, more genuinely itself than the curated version had ever been. He had been so afraid of losing respect that he had never asked the question underneath the fear. Whose respect would he still have if he became entirely, uncomplicatedly himself? And the answer, which arrived not as a thought but as a recognition, was the most unsettling and the most peaceful thing he had ever encountered, his own. He had never, not once, given himself the one form of respect that no external circumstance could grant or revoke. Most people at the end of a long life spent managing their image in the eyes of the world, arrive at a similar recognition. Not all of them, but some, and those who do speak of it the same way. Not as a triumph, not as a resolution, but as something closer to waking from a dream and finding, with quiet astonishment, that the room you are in is far larger than the dream suggested. The fear of losing respect is not the problem. It is the symptom. The problem is older and quieter than the fear. He had never, not once, given himself the one form of respect that no external circumstance could grant or revoke. Most people, at the end of a long life spent managing their image in the eyes of the world, arrive at a similar recognition. Not all of them, but some, and those who do speak of it the same way. Not as a triumph, not as a resolution, but as something closer to waking from a dream and finding, with quiet astonishment, that the room you are in is far larger than the dream suggested. The fear of losing respect is not the problem. It is the symptom. The problem is older and quieter than the fear. It is the belief that the self is a reputation, that what others see when they look at you is the thing that is most real about you, that the story the world holds of you is more true than the awareness that is reading these words right now, in this moment, needing no permission from anyone to exist. The Buddha did not say this is easy to see through. He said it is possible. And the people who catch even a glimpse of what lies on the other side of that fear describe it with a word that surprises most people who have not yet found their way there. They call it rest, not peace in the philosophical sense, not freedom in the dramatic sense, simply rest. The rest of someone who has finally, after a very long time, put down something very heavy. The weight was never truly theirs to carry. It never was.